Good morning, Mind the Product. It's like 2 in the morning, I think. It's nice to see everybody here. It's always fun to come to these events that are full of kindred spirits, because I think we all share something in common. On your conference bags, right, it says, build products people love. And I don't know about you, but that's one of the things that gets me out of bed in the morning. Probably curating your JIRA backlog is not that thing. I've always liked the name of this event because to me, Mind the Product implies a duty of stewardship, right? Product management is about caring for the product and for the people that we're building things for, right? We're all here to make things that make people's lives better. Maybe we make people's lives better in big ways, like making government actually safe for citizens. Maybe we make life better in small ways, like making that piece of enterprise software just a little easier to use. It doesn't matter how big or small that change is, as long as we're making life better. Now, I think if you look at tech as an industry, we have a pretty good track record, actually, of making things that make life better, right? Our products mean freedom to wander around a strange city like London and not actually worry about getting lost. As long as you have that GPS in your pocket, it's all good. You can find a train, you can summon a car with a press of a button. That's freedom. That's a pretty big benefit. Tech products give us flexibility to earn money whenever we want, from wherever we want, whether that's telecommuting or picking our own work hours. They give us independence. If we're limited by mobility, wow, e-commerce, we can get anything delivered to our doors. And connection to other people. Whether you have a rare disease or just kind of a weird hobby, you can find your tribe online and hang out with them, learn from them, get support in ways that we've never been able to before. I feel pretty good about being part of a community that builds stuff like that. It makes the world a better place. But if we're honest, we know that our products don't always make life better. Sometimes our products are kind of needy and annoying. They always want to give us notifications and fill our inboxes with emails saying, we miss you, come back. Come spend money with us, come spend time with us. Look at our ads. Here's a notification. Come look at our new visual design. We're proud of it. You don't care, but we hope you do. Our products can be irritating. They can steal our focus during the workday, and they're always trying to steal our attention. Attention theft is a problem we all have to deal with. But our products can sometimes be more than annoying, and they can steal more than our attention. There's increasing evidence that the more time we spend online, the worse off we are. Products, in some cases, are stealing our sleep, our self-esteem. They're increasing our anxiety and depression and suicidality. The more time we spend online, the less healthy we are. That's not a good thing. Now, we can point fingers at specific products, but actually it's everything we do online cumulatively is not really healthy for us. That's maybe not something to be so proud of. And I think we're seeing that increasingly, some of our technology products are not so good for the health of our societies either. Even though connection online is good, sometimes we're actually eroding those connections online. And we're eroding the respect for other people, whether we have bad actors who are trying to stir up genocide or interfere in an election, or we have well-intended people who are just kind of unthinkingly forwarding misinformation, or sometimes we have software that's making decisions about what we see based on what drives engagement, and that's leading people to ever more extremist content. But it drives the metric, doesn't it? Engagement's good. Now, it's easy to look at some of the decisions that companies make and think, oh, Dr. Evil is sitting in a room and making bad choices, or faceless corporations are doing bad things. But it's all of us. It's a bunch of smart, well-intended people who come up with this stuff. Somebody decided, hey, let's show free videos online because people can learn from them and maybe be entertained by them, and I guess we should support those with ads. And somebody else said, well, yeah, I think engagement is the metric we should look at in order to drive that ad-based business. And somebody else said, okay, here's how we're going to make that software behave in order to improve engagement. And somebody else said, well, how are we going to enforce rules against toxic content? And they decided what that policy was. And somebody else decided, how do we hire and train the people who have to look at that toxic content and be traumatized by it? So there's a whole lot of decisions that go in to making these products. And the sum total of those decisions are the product. We like to think that as designers and developers and product managers that we design the product. We don't. right? We only build a fraction of it. The pixels, the code, all that isn't the product. It's all the decisions. And those decisions are made by lots of different people. The executive team decides what the corporate priorities are, right? The legal team decides the terms of service. The support team makes decisions. That frontline employee makes a decision about whether to smile today or be helpful. And we all know what happens when the lawyers start making design decisions. It's not so pretty, right? Now, I love Twitter. It gives me good fodder sometimes. We've all seen examples of people making terrible design choices, right? But the fact is that lawyers will always make design decisions. This will always happen. Customer service people will always make design decisions. Executives will always make design decisions. I don't care what anybody's job title is. We are all designing the stuff that we deliver. So how do we equip the lawyers and everybody else with decisions that make sense for human beings? Because they're all well-intended. They're all making these choices for what they think are good reasons. And the net result is sometimes not so good. So I like that Martin started off by saying we're all making it up as we go along, because I think that's true. When you think about the world that we live in right now, all this connectedness, the fact that we are always on, always connected to other people and services and devices, this is all still pretty new. We're sailing uncharted seas. We don't know where the reefs are hiding, and there's a bunch of them there, actually, that could sink us if we hit them. One of those reefs is data collection. We know more about people than ever before. We have reams and reams of data. We have information not just about their behavior online. We can instrument everything you do and track you across websites and devices. We have sensors. We can actually understand what you're saying in your email and even in your in-person conversations, and we can use that to deliver you ads. We can know your heart rate. Heck, Apple even knows whether you're having adult activities at night based on your sensors. We know all kinds of stuff about people. And we can combine that information with data from other sources. So what data is even okay to collect about people? What collection methods are okay? Now, GDPR, I know, puts some limits on that in Europe, at least in theory. As far as I can tell so far, it's actually just putting a bunch of legalese on top of behavior people were already doing, and not actually changing much about what we're collecting. But I'm not talking about regulation. I'm talking about what's acceptable, what's ethical and okay to collect about people. Because every piece of information we collect about someone maybe puts their privacy at risk, if nothing else. What's okay to do when we have that information? How is it okay to use it? Is it acceptable that we give Facebook a piece of two-factor authentication information and they use it for ad targeting, even if that wasn't the intent? Is it acceptable that Google or Facebook or anybody else looks at the content of our email or turns on the microphone and listens to our keywords and uses that to deliver ads? Is that okay with us? Is it okay that Target stores look at information about you to figure out whether or not you might be pregnant because they sure would like to sell you a baby stroller? Is that okay? Is it okay for companies to try to figure out potentially sensitive things about us based on the data they have? These are tough questions. And by the way, while we're busy figuring things out about people, we have software starting to make decisions about people. And so when we have AI looking at which job applicants are interesting or deciding who should get a home loan, how do we avoid making those things just replicate and amplify our biases? And how do we know if they're doing that? Tough calls, all of them. And in some ways, one of the biggest reefs that we have to worry about running into is when is it okay to influence behavior? Now, when I started in product design in the 90s, we were mostly about enabling the behavior that people were asking products to do. It wasn't about influencing them. Increasingly, though, almost all of us are trying to change behavior in some ways. Now, there's some cases I think we can all agree on. Using some sort of a health product to try and nudge people to stand up more or do other things that are good for their health. I think most of us would agree that persuasive design is okay there. But we're also using persuasive design techniques to do things that are about our business interests, right? About our bottom line. So what are the boundaries there? When is it okay to try to change behavior to drive engagement and get people to watch more ads? When is it okay to change how Uber drivers behave to drive the bottom line? When does it become When does it go from being mutually interesting and beneficial to being exploitative? What's the boundary? That's a hard decision to make. It's a hard conversation to have. And Martin talks about being awkward. Yeah, that's an awkward one. We don't really have the tools to make those choices. And in the absence of good tools, and not having a map for those uncharted seas, well, what we're really trying to do in a lot of cases is we're using the engine gauges to try and steer the ship. What I see in a lot of organizations is what I think of as metric-centered design, right? People come up with something to measure. We design some intervention that we think will move that number. We measure it, we try again. And then when we move it, we celebrate it and we say, we moved the metric. That's a good thing, right? Because moving metrics gets us rewarded. Gets us more budget, gets us more influence. We need the metrics. This is not an anti-metrics rant. But I do think we have some challenges in our relationship with metrics. We need metrics, okay? We need the focus. Our teams need clear things to work toward. We need the tools to measure and to get feedback so that we can learn and do things better. We need metrics. We need the bragging rights. We need the political influence and cover that metrics give us. That's all good, it's all important. But metrics are kind of like RNA in the body. RNA tells our cells what proteins to make. It regulates a lot of our biological processes. And when the RNA is healthy, it's all good. Miracles happen. But what happens when the RNA is broken? Well, we get dysregulation in the biology, right? We start to make too many of the wrong proteins, or we make the proteins wrong. And we get disease processes that start. And then our cells start to replicate out of control, and we get sick. And metrics, used the wrong way, actually are a bit of a disease. It's a disease in which we start to confuse the goal with the metric. Asa Raskin talked about the negative influence of over-focusing on a metric in an interview with the BBC this summer. He said, you know, infinite scroll was a good solution to driving engagement. It's a good way to get people hooked. Now, do we think it's a good sign that we talk about what we do using the language of drug dealers? I don't think so. I don't think that's a healthy sign at all. So, metrics can lead us astray. Metric-centered design isn't the right thing to do. We talk about user-centered design, but I think we actually need to go a little farther than that because, for example, if we focus on just that person using the software, we're not thinking about what are the collateral effects on other people and on society in general. So I think we do need to be human-centered. We need to think about how can we make those product decisions differently. It's hard to do, though. So there's a few things I think we can do. One is I think we can be explicit about what human-centered means. It's a fuzzy term, right? Your definition of human-centered, your definition, mine, might be a little different. And so we can have a lot of arguments about it and not really get anywhere. A lot of people assume that just because a designer did it, it's somehow automatically human-centered. Boy, are they wrong. Design tools, this is just a skill set, just like science. The tools and techniques of design can be used to do bad stuff just like science can. Design as a skill set is value neutral. It's the human-centered part of design that's the word that matters. Design isn't actually the word that matters that much at all. I would rather see ugly, crappy design in a human-centered organization than beautifully crafted stuff in a place with the wrong values, okay? Because design can be used to perpetuate situations and to normalize situations that aren't so healthy. Gosh, open offices are a problem, so let's put horse blinders on humans. Some industrial designer is saying, I did good. No, you didn't. No. So how do we define human-centered in a way that we can actually act on? I don't know if you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I actually think it's a pretty good start on understanding what human-centered means to me. If you don't know Maslow, he says our fundamental needs are the basis for everything. Our physiological needs, food, air, water, sleep. If we don't get these things, we die. Okay? We don't want to mess with this stuff. Once our physiological needs are taken care of, that's when we start to worry about things like safety and shelter. Am I safe from harm? Do I have a place to sleep? Once those are taken care of, that's when we worry about things like love and connectedness and belonging. Do I feel like I'm part of a community? Do I have a place in the world? And once we have that, Do we have the esteem of the people in our community? Do we feel valued? Do we value ourselves? And once all of these things are in place, we can achieve self-actualization, which is a fancy word for achieving our potential. Can I be the best me that I want to be, whatever that means to me? We can't actually do that if we're worried about food and shelter, or if we don't feel like we're part of a community, or if we don't feel valued. So when I think about human-centered design, I think of a solution that works on at least one of these points in Maslow's hierarchy for some group of people. It provides some benefit in one of these domains. When we define product value, what part of Maslow's hierarchy are we talking about? And here's the piece we often miss. We don't mess with Maslow's hierarchy, any of it, for anybody else. So just because we help one group of people, we also need to make sure it's not at the expense of something in Maslow's hierarchy for other people. I think this starts to give us a filter in which we can talk about, say, which things about our product are important to work on. Let's take the Internet of Things for an example. Home automation. Now, for me personally, home automation isn't really a Maslow's hierarchy issue. It's convenience. My life is not fundamentally different if I can, change my lights from my iPhone or if I have to get up and walk across the room. But if you're somebody who has mobility challenges, for example, well, home automation can mean self-actualization. It can mean independence. It can mean living fundamentally a better life than you do today. So that's pretty good. That's a real benefit. But humans, we're uniquely talented at finding ways to be awful to each other. And so if somebody can do awful things to other people with your product, they will find a way to do it. So domestic abusers have found creative things to do with home automation. They're locking their spouses out of the lights. They're cranking the temperature up so it's intolerable, and guess what? You can't change it. They're maybe not in the home because they have a restraining order or something. Well, they're going to crank up a loud alarm in the middle of the night so you don't get sleep. Wow. So the product itself isn't doing harm, but it's being used to mess with some pretty fundamental stuff in Maslow's hierarchy. So if this were my product, I would be looking at, we could spend time on this feature that's a minor convenience for somebody, or we can spend money not messing with Maslow's hierarchy for a subset of people who maybe aren't even our users. Which of these am I going to invest effort in? The answer is pretty clear to me. But I think if we start to use this as a framework, we have some ways to make those choices as a team. Now, I think the principle is a great starting point, but it's often not enough to drive good decision-making. I think we also need to define the boundaries of what's acceptable. So I think as a profession, we need to think about something along the lines of the Nuremberg Code. Now, the reason I say this is because I've actually spent a lot of time in the last few years working with medical researchers. And when you look at the internet, it's actually the biggest interventional study ever done. We're collecting data about people in unprecedented volumes. We're trying to influence their behavior based on data and collecting data about how that works. And all of this is being done largely without their consent. Sure looks like an interventional clinical study to me. So in medical research, everyone is, actually anywhere you do human subjects research, everyone's very aware of the Nuremberg Code. If you're not familiar with it, this arose from the Nuremberg trials, 1947, where the world got to see exactly what the Nazi doctors were doing in the name of improving medicine, right? They were inflicting lots of atrocities on unwilling people and calling it good science. And the medical community said, wow, we need some guidelines. And so now, if you do any kind of medical research or any human subjects research in an academic setting, you have to go in front of something called an IRB, an Institutional Review Board. And scientists tend to hate IRBs, but they know why they exist. They're inconvenient, but they're really important. Because an IRB is going to ask you a handful of very hard questions based on the 10 principles of the Nuremberg Code. One of those questions will be, what's the benefit to the participants and to society as a whole? Why is this even a good thing? Is this the only way to gather this information or to achieve this benefit? Or is there maybe some other lower risk way to do it? Do we have to do it like this? is the risk to that participant proportional to the benefit they get? I think about this every time some airport Wi-Fi wants like my home address and my date of birth, like, wow, my risk of identity theft versus the convenience of Wi-Fi, thank you. I'll stick with cellular data, right? And an IRB will ask you what kinds of harm are possible. So something that needs to be a regular part of our practice is to look at any feature we're creating and think, how could people use this to be awful to each other? How could we create harm to people by building this feature? What's possible? And this is where diverse teams get to be really important, because if you've led a pretty comfortable life, you might not have a very good imagination about some of the harm that might result. So when people are telling you, oh, here are some ways in which women or people of color or other folks who tend to be targeted might be harmed by this, listen. And if you don't have those voices in the room, get them in the room. And an IRB is not going to just accept a list of possible harm. They want to know what are your plans to actually mitigate that harm if it happens, and do you have the resources? So I think this starts to give us a great set of questions to ask about any change we might make to a product. So let's say we are the Uber team, and we're trying to think about some new feature to influence driver behavior, because probably some of that is perfectly acceptable, but where's the boundary? So our first question should be, okay, it's going to drive our revenue. How does it help drivers? Is it of benefit to them? Does it increase their wages? Does it increase their flexibility, their control? How is it good for them? And we can go from there, right? So I think this starts to give us a decision framework. Now, Roomba, anybody use these to suck up all the cat hair on your floor? I haven't tried one. I hear they work pretty well. But what do you give up in exchange for that, right? You think you have a device that's just going to clean up your floors. It's also mapping your house in order to clean up your floors, which seems okay. But then somebody at Roomba decides, we're going to start to sell that data. So the first question, how does that benefit the homeowner who bought that product? It doesn't. So where do you go with that, right? These guys floated this idea and pretty much got shouted down by the internet, so I don't think they went down this path, but they could have caught that bad idea earlier. So one of the things that the Roomba folks missed is actually the most important principle in the Nuremberg Code, which is that consent needs to be both informed and truly voluntary, okay? As a homeowner who buys the Roomba, you are not informed that they're going to sell your data, and you're not consenting to it. And when I say informed, I don't mean that there's a 20-page set of terms and conditions and a checkbox that you read that says you've agreed to them, because whoever reads, right? We know we don't do that. In a clinical trial, a researcher will actually sit down with you and walk through that consent often and say, here are the risks. Here's what might happen. And occasionally in a clinical trial, you'll even do a quiz and ask people questions to make sure they understand the potential harms. It's not about reading a big, long document. So that's what I mean by informed. Do people actually get it? Not have we put the legalese in front of them? And participation can't be coerced. So for example, you can't do research in a prison population without very, very close scrutiny. They have to be people who can consent. And people need to be able to withdraw that consent at any time. So if you're a product manager at Mattel and you think, gosh, it would be nice if Barbie could listen to what kids are saying, and then we can sell that data to lots of other people. No IRB on the planet would accept that. Because a kid who's the age to play with Barbie can't actually meaningfully consent to the use of their data. They can't consent to that kind of a privacy violation. So that would never get by IRB. We shouldn't have to go to an IRB to make that decision. That should have been a really obvious one from the get-go. But I think we need to ask these questions about our own methods as well. So we all do lots of things to try to make our product better. I bet some of you use session replay tools, for example. Now in theory, so these things let you watch the browsing session of an individual user, and in theory, that user's de-identified and anonymous, and that this is all perfectly safe. And researchers are showing, actually, it's not that hard to re-identify people. That's true of any de-identified data, pretty much. And in some cases, these things are not implemented properly, and they expose passwords and bank balances and lots of other things. And let's go back to that consent principle, okay? I think most internet users understand that there's some generic tracking going on, But if you sat most internet users down and said, you know, a design team can actually watch your entire browsing session from start to finish, I think most would be kind of grossed out by that. Can they meaningfully consent? Is this a good method for us to use? So I do think we need data. We do need metrics. We do need all these insights. But let's not be data-driven. Data has no conscience. It should not be in charge. Our metrics shouldn't be making our decisions for us. Instead, let's be goal-focused, let's be guided by our values, and let's just be informed by data. It's just one of our tools. So what I mean by goals is, what's the thing we're trying to achieve in the first place? Values are what we will not sacrifice to achieve the goal. We all make these trade-offs in real life. There's always something we're not willing to sacrifice. Metrics are how we measure progress toward both of those things, and the both is pretty important. Let's talk about each of those. So let's say that our goal is to buy a house. We could achieve this goal in lots of ways. We could scrimp and save and build up the money to do that. We could find a rich relative, talk them into giving us some money. We could win the lottery. We could rob a bank. Lots of ways to do this. Our values tell us that at least one of those is probably not an acceptable solution. Robbing a bank, not so good. Values tell us what solutions are not okay. Values also tell us what are the boundaries on our solutions. So let's say that saving money seems like the right solution to us. There's a limit to how much money we want to save. So perhaps we value ski vacations with family. Those are expensive. That's going to eat into how much we can put in the savings account. So that metric will only advance so quickly because there's something we're not willing to give up. That's okay. That's what I mean by values balancing the goals, right? They put limits on it, and that's appropriate. Being explicit about the goal, though, and separating it from the metric also helps us to choose better metrics. Let's say my goal is to climb to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. Well, one metric I could use that's easy to measure, because I have a watch, is my VO2 max, right? My cardiovascular capacity. That's easy to measure. But is it really the right metric? Because it's just about how well I breathe and use oxygen. Making it to the top of Kilimanjaro is, frankly, about my stick-to-itiveness and about how strong my legs are and how much endurance I have. And so it might be better to measure something like what's the longest hike I can complete, or how much weight can I carry. Right? Those are a little harder to measure, but they're probably much more indicative of how close I am to being able to climb that mountain. So just to give you a real-world example, patients like me, Stephen Haywood, who's on the left there, was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. If you're not familiar with it, it's a neurodegenerative disease that is usually fatal on average within about 5 years. And people progressively lose their ability to walk, their ability to talk, and swallow, and eventually breathe. There is no cure, and the options for treatment are slim to none. So what happens in ALS is people basically self-experiment. People are trying anything, because what do they have to lose? So his brothers, Jamie and Ben, said, why don't we pool all the experiences of those individual ALS patients together so they can share strategies and learn from each other, and if we turn that into structured medical data, we can start to figure out what is working for people and build up evidence. So for example, patients like me was able to prove that lithium as a treatment for ALS is useless before the clinical trial did. Powerful stuff. So the goal at patients like me is really to gather as much data as we need to solve the medical problem, right? But what happens when you put together a bunch of scientists and say, get all the data? Scientists have very long wish lists. They're very greedy about the data they want. And so what that means in practice is you're asking a bunch of sick people with limited time and energy to answer a lot of questions. And so if you're looking at a metric like data density, that starts to lead you to pile on a bunch of questions and use everything you can to try and crank up that data density. But are you creating a good experience? Maybe not. So the values at patients like me are very patient-centered for obvious reasons, but the execution wasn't there. The execution was often more data-centered. And so one of the steps we took was we said, look, let's define some very concrete principles that will help guide decisions about the product. Principles that help define what patient-centered means in this context. And so the Nuremberg Code and Maslow's hierarchy are a good starting point, but I think every team needs some context-specific values to help guide what they do. One of those principles is, and by the way, they're all written in the patient's voice, sort of for this context. One of those principles is help me feel in control. You know what it's like if you're sick? You don't feel in control of your body, your environment, your healthcare. We can at least help your patients like me experience feel like something that's in your control. So one of the things that we did is we said, look, anytime we're asking a user a question, especially if it's one we ask you over and over again every month, we're also going to give them the option to say, stop asking me this. I don't like this question, it doesn't feel relevant to me, or just you're asking too many questions, go away. Patients appreciate this level of control. Most don't actually use this, but a few do. They'll turn off questions. So every time a new scientist joins the team, they're like, you're giving people the chance to not answer my questions? You're making my life so hard. And I say, yep, too bad. Because if we don't do it when it's inconvenient, it's not a value. If we only do it when it's convenient for us, it's marketing. Values are things we won't sacrifice. And that always means we're losing a little bit of that goal, right? We're shaving something off that metric. We're not going to every length because we have limits. Now, Roy Disney says that when your values are clear, decisions get easier. And I agree. You have to make them really concrete. Just saying, oh, we want to be user-centered, it's too vague. Nobody knows how to act on that. You have to make it explicit, or teams can't use it. Now, how's our decision-making working? Well, we use metrics to see if we're doing the right things toward the goal, but we have to balance those metrics with value metrics. So what I would suggest to you is, A, never put up a naked metric without describing the goal, and B, don't use just one metric. Also look at what you might be trading off in order to move that metric. So at patients like me, the goal is to get the data to do the science, so the obvious metric there is about the data density. But how do you also measure that value of helping people feel in control? And it's tricky, because we can't just instrument this with a script. Right? We can't just track their behavior and understand. We actually have to ask. So we did. So we started asking patients things like, hey, do these questions feel relevant to you? You know, we say one of our values is about empowering patients to make better treatment decisions. So we ask, do you feel more able to have those conversations with your doctor? Now, I don't mean that every bit of user feedback is useful, right? Anytime Facebook asks me, does Facebook care about you? I'm like, oh, go away, right? Because that's not meaningful. That's actually about them, it's not about me. But we have to ask. These things are harder to measure than the easy metrics, but they're the things that matter. Now, speaking of Facebook, there's some awesome people on that team. I know this stuff keeps them awake at night. Imagine the conversation in that team if we weren't just measuring engagement, but if they said, well, is this design change going to affect Maslow's hierarchy? Did this thing that we just changed, did this tweak to the news feed make people more connected to other people? It's hard to measure. We can't just instrument it, but there are some ways you could measure it. You could say, the value we're trying to promote is belonging and esteem. Mark Zuckerberg says Facebook is about making humans more connected to other humans. All right, well, let's measure that. How connected do we feel? Do we feel valued by other people after we use this tool? Do we actually learn to value other people who are maybe different from us, or do we value them less? These things are tricky to measure, but they are possible to measure. It's done in psychological studies all the time. So it takes a bit of investment to understand how to measure these things, and it takes a bit of work to do it. And we can't do it completely seamlessly with our users. It's not invisible to them. But these are questions actually people appreciate being asked. When we've asked at patients like me any of these questions of people, they're like, oh, I'm so glad you're asking me this. And the feedback is generally pretty good because they feel meaningful. Getting humans to be humane to other humans, making products humane to humans, is not easy stuff. But we all have the ability to start small. We can all talk about within our teams what human-centered means. we can develop some criteria and some rubrics to use for that. We can start to use metrics differently. We can define some things that are about measuring our values, because the thing is, if we only measure the goals we're measuring, the metrics we're measuring today, we're going to keep making those bad decisions. Because until we learn to measure what really matters, until we learn to measure the values, we're going to overvalue the things that are easy to measure. And that isn't going to help us build awesome products that people love. Thanks for listening.